have weapons of mass destruction. That is what this war was about. Saddam Hussein possesses biological and chemical weapons. The fact that there are weapons there. You've heard the president say repeatedly that he has chemical and biological weapons.
That Saddam Hussein still has chemical and biological weapons, and he is moving ever closer to developing a nuclear weapon. Iraq has a growing fleet of manned and unmanned aerial vehicles, high-strength aluminum tubes suitable for nuclear weapons production. Thousands of tons of chemical agents, 500 tons of sarin, mustard, and VX nerve agent. It continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised. The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
They have weapons of mass destruction. That is what this war was about.
There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
Saddam Hussein is a homicidal dictator who is addicted to weapons of mass destruction.
They have weapons of mass destruction. That is what this war was about.
Where are Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction?
Former Chief Weapons Inspector David Kay said last week, quote, "We were all wrong about Saddam's WMD."
By now, the world knows there was a massive intelligence failure in the war on Iraq. President Bush and other countries.
The failure to find Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction has raised serious questions about the legitimacy and legality of the ongoing war in Iraq. But as both American and Iraqi casualties escalate, and as the conflict becomes more chaotic and deadly by the day, debate within the United States continues to focus narrowly on whether American intelligence agencies provided accurate enough information to justify going to war. In the process, a larger question has been all but ignored. If the war was not about weapons of mass destruction, what is it really about?
I keep asking the questions of why and how. Does this incident even have a purpose?
Pursuing this question forces us to consider a different story. It is a story that begins as the Cold War ends. A story about a group of self-identified radical conservatives at the right-wing extreme of the Republican Party. A group of intellectuals and policymakers who saw the fall of the Soviet Union and communism not as an opportunity to scale back America's Cold War military machine, but as an opportunity to build up its size and scale, to use military force more aggressively and unilaterally, to construct a new, unchallenged American empire.
It's this kind of ideology that has grown up in the wake of the Cold War, propounded quite openly by what we are calling neoconservatives in America, that identifies the United States as a colossus athwart the world, a new Rome, beyond good and evil. We no longer need friends. We don't need international law. Like the old Roman phrase, it doesn't matter whether they love us or not, so long as they fear us.
Repeat after me. I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly.
When George W. Bush took office in 2000, he brought with him some of the most conservative foreign policy voices in the Republican Party. Chief among them were Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Deputy Secretary for Defense Paul Wolfowitz, all of whom had served together previously in the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Paul Wolfowitz, in particular, had long been recognized as the intellectual force behind a radical neoconservative fringe of the Republican Party. For years, Wolfowitz had been advancing the idea that the United States should reconsider its commitments to international treaties, international law, and multilateral organizations such as the United Nations.
You know, so this is not just a Republican takeover. This is a very specific wing of the Republican Party. It's neoconservative, it's unilateralist, it doesn't believe in the rule of law, it doesn't believe you have to tell the public the truth.
And they happen to be an extremely arrogant, dangerous group of reactionary statists. They're not conservatives.
They have a political agenda with regards to foreign policy that they had been working on for years and years, and writing about this and saying this is the post-Cold War vision. This is our post-Cold War vision for American power.
Ever since the Cold War ended, there were people who were fuming on the right, thinking, this is the golden opportunity now that Russia's out of the way for America to take over the world. We're not doing anything about it. Those damn liberals, those soft heads, are keeping us from doing what is our godly mission.
A radical plan for American military domination first surfaced during the administration of George H.W. Bush. In 1992, Paul Wolfowitz, working in the Department of Defense, was asked to write the first draft of a new national security strategy, a document entitled the Defense Planning Guidance. The most controversial elements of what would later come to be known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine were that the United States should dramatically increase defense spending, that it should be willing to take preemptive military action, and that it should be willing to use military force unilaterally, with or without allies. This new reliance on military force was necessary, according to Wolfowitz, to prevent the emergence of any future or potential rivals to American power, and to secure access to vital resources, especially Persian Gulf oil.
This caused uproar when it was leaked, and the Europeans got upset, and people like Colin Powell and George Herbert Walker Bush, and to some extent even Cheney said, this is kind of out there, guys. You gotta tone that down, because the end of the Cold War is not necessarily a green light for us to go ballistic and building up our military and pushing countries around using the sword rather than diplomacy. But these guys never let go of that.
Out of power during the Clinton presidency, Wolfowitz and his colleagues affiliated themselves with a number of influential conservative think tanks. In 2000, they would craft yet another proposed national security strategy, this one published by a right-wing think tank calling itself the Project for the New American Century. At its core, the document revived the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It called on the United States to increase the military budget by up to $100 billion, to deny other nations the use of outer space, and to adopt a more aggressive and unilateral foreign policy that would allow the United States to act offensively and preemptively in the world. The elimination of states like Iraq figured prominently in this grand vision.
They were coming out against the policy of every American president, from Nixon to Clinton to even George Bush in his first year. They wanted to change that.
But even these hardline conservatives knew that the Wolfowitz Doctrine was likely too radical to win the support of the foreign policy establishment, their own Republican Party, and the American people. In their defining document, written in September of 2000, a full year before 9/11, they acknowledged that the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one. Absent, in their own chilling words, some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year later, that event would arrive.
But I couldn't breathe at all. I find it really hard to talk.
They're both down now. It's just a huge cloud of smoke.
We have an airplane that crashed into the Pentagon.
After 9/11, we have a very clear experience of what terrorism is, and people should feel afraid. The question is, what policies will make us more safe? So the fear is legitimate, but it is manipulated, and that's the core of the Bush policy, to manipulate that fear.
There will be no going back to the era before September the 11th, 2001, to false comfort in a dangerous world.
I've been a born New Yorker all my life. I've lived here all my life. So for me, it was a powerful personal event. What I remember, what I think it taught, of course, my first reaction was fear, anger, rage, vengeance. I think all of us, if we're human, had that reaction. The question for all of us is what we remember and what we do with the memories. What is the lesson? What does it tell? What does it teach? For the president, it teaches the lesson of the axis of evil.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
It teaches the lesson that America has enemies, secret, dangerous enemies who have to be taken out.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
It teaches the lesson that we can never be weak. We have to flex our muscles at every turn.
We will fight with the full force and might of the United States military.
That's one kind of lesson. It creates a politics of fear.
We have every reason to assume the worst.
If you look at, say, FDR saying the only thing you have to fear is fear itself, the kind of tacit counterpoint to that from the Bush administration after 9/11 was the only thing you have to fear is not enough fear.
We still have a dangerous world. And that's very important for, I think the people understand where I'm coming from, to know that this is a dangerous world.
We discussed the need to prepare for a full range of asymmetric threats, including terrorism, cyber attacks, advanced conventional weapons, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and certainly weapons of mass destruction.
This is a gang that needs people to be afraid. It's a gang that really can't have any political success whatsoever in a state of tranquility and peace of mind.
Tom Ridge, convinced terrorists will try to hit America.
You know, the politics of fear that this administration has deployed in trying to respond to terrorism has itself in some ways been much more dangerous than terrorism itself. And this administration has been, I think, responsible for inciting the very terror that it was the terrorists' purpose to incite in America.
Calling it Code Orange Plus. The Fed's decision to raise the terror alert to high. America on high alert from biggest cities to smallest towns.
Red, yellow, orange. We're afraid. Be afraid. What level of fear? The government can program that without any justification. You know, we have an intelligence report. The terrorists are about to attack. Who? We don't know. Where? We don't know. What? We don't know. But you tell us, so now we're afraid.
A Connecticut man wrapping his family's 19th century farmhouse with plastic, sealing it in duct tape.
And then, in the same breath, you know, while the smoke's still rising out of the ruins of the World Trade Center and now the Pentagon, we're told that this has gone beyond simply 19 men hijacking 4 airplanes. And this has turned into a global conspiracy against the United States that must be confronted militarily.
One has to say it's not just simply a matter of capturing people and holding them accountable, but removing the sanctuaries, removing the support systems, ending states who sponsor terrorism.
We're too great a nation to allow the evildoers to affect our soul.
The decision was made within the administration to take this event, to take the struggle against al-Qaeda, and make it into a full-fledged struggle against good and evil.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
The important thing to remember here is one didn't have to put it in these terms. One didn't have to say, if you're not for us, on our side, you're on the side of the terrorists. That was not a necessary response. That was a chosen response.
Within a year of 9/11, in a charged climate of fear, anxiety, and lingering outrage over the attacks on the World Trade Center, George W. Bush traveled to West Point to announce the basic elements of his own new national security strategy. Invoking the memory of the 9/11 terror attacks, he made the Wolfowitz Doctrine official U.S. policy, in the process setting the stage for a U.S. invasion of Iraq.
We must take the battle to the enemy disrupt his plans, and confront the worst threats before they emerge.
It was a brazen announcement that the United States now officially rejected Article 51 of the UN Charter, a cornerstone of international law enacted after World War II and used to convict Nazis of war crimes at the Nuremberg trials. A law designed explicitly to prevent nations from using military force to advance their own sense of national and moral superiority, and to prevent the kind of unprovoked so-called preemptive wars of aggression that ravaged the world over the first half of the 20th century.
And our security require all Americans to be forward-looking and resolute, to be ready for preemptive action.
It moves, for the first time in its history, it moves the United States outside of the compass of international law, away from Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, and says in effect that the United States will make war at a time and place of its choosing against enemies that it declares its enemies based on its own perception of what the threats are.
It was hailed as a new strategy, but it was based on old ideas. It marked the culmination of a relentless campaign by radical conservatives to change the very nature of American foreign policy, to use unrivaled American military power to shape the globe and the 21st century itself in the image of the United States, to create, in their own words, a new American century.
And this is a strange notion, actually, that people think that the whole world, because we all live in the same time, right? It's 2003 for everybody, it'll be 2004 for everybody, but that, that America has no territorial bounds, but that actually time belongs to America.
They want the USA to outdo all previous empires, not in its longevity, but in its permanence, which, for all their work in college and all their wide reading, is an insane program. What does it have to do with the Constitution? What does it have to do with democracy? What does it have to do with the pursuit of happiness? Nothing. It's about power. It's about domination. It's about control of dwindling resources.
I understand that they want the American public to believe that the invasion of Iraq was the response to September 11th. I think it is a lie. I believe that it is part of a neoconservative agenda to assert that American hegemony is untouchable. And September 11th gave them the opportunity to put in play plans that they had been considering since the first Bush administration.
In all of its previous incarnations, and long before 9/11 and the current war on terror, the Wolfowitz Doctrine had identified regime change in Iraq as a crucial first step toward global domination by force. In a widely circulated letter to President Bill Clinton in 1998, the members of the Project for the New American Century challenged the president to act forcefully and militarily to remove Saddam Hussein from power. 2 years later, George W. Bush would handpick many of these same neoconservatives for key foreign policy posts in the Pentagon and State Department. Once installed in government positions, as recent interviews with a number of former members of the Bush administration have revealed, the group maintained its long-standing focus on Iraq, a focus that intensified after the attacks of September 11.
In the meetings of the inner sanctum of the Bush administration, the attack on Iraq was brought up from almost the first days, even though there was no evidence whatever that the Iraqis had been involved in this.
The president dragged me into a room with a couple of other people, shut the door, and said, I want you to find whether Iraq did this. That George Bush wanted me to come back with a report that said, Iraq did this.
From the very beginning, there was a conviction that Saddam Hussein was a bad person and that he needed to go.
Just 5 hours after American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon, and without any evidence linking Saddam Hussein to the attacks of 9/11, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was already ordering his aides to draw up plans for striking Iraq. The notes quote Rumsfeld as saying he wanted best info fast, judge whether good enough hit SH, meaning Saddam Hussein. Go massive, Rumsfeld continued in the notes. Sweep it all up, things related and not.
The problem for the Bush administration is that plans that already existed for regime change in Iraq had to be justified. They couldn't just go in without public support. The public support was created by connecting Saddam Hussein to those fears of terrorism. The fear generated by 9/11, the fear of terrorist networks, has to be transferred to Iraq. That is, the American people have to learn to be as afraid of Saddam Hussein as they are of Osama bin Laden.
Soon after September 11th, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld set up a small intelligence office in the Pentagon, the Office of Special Plans, to create the rationales for the already planned attack on Iraq, to convince people that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and that he was linked to Al-Qaeda and 9/11. Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski worked in the Pentagon's Near East and South Asia office. She witnessed how the Office of Special Plans issued talking points about Iraq for senior government officials, allegedly based on intelligence.
The information in there drawn from fact. You could find bits and pieces of fact throughout, but framed, articulated, crafted to convince someone of what? Well, of things that weren't true. Things that weren't true. 9/11, Al-Qaeda related to Saddam Hussein, possibly some involvement there.
The liberation of Iraq is a crucial advance in the campaign against terror. We've removed an ally of Al-Qaeda.
The very things that a year later, President Bush himself denies and feigns his surprise. I don't know why everybody thinks that.
We've had no evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved with the September the 11th.
Well, I worked in a place where they concentrated on preparing this storyline and selling it to everyone that they could possibly sell it to.
It wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was the manipulation of intelligence to achieve a political goal. They were disciplined. They stayed on message. They marshaled all of their forces in this relentless public relations campaign to convince the American people that there was a threat from Iraq.
It's day 4 of the Bush team's full-court press, giving speech after speech after speech and issuing reports.
The United States knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Any country on the face of the earth with an active intelligence program knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
The choice is his. And if he does not disarm, the United States of America will lead a coalition and disarm him in the name of peace.
Out of the president's mouth, vice president's mouth, the same things that were being given to us to put into our superiors, our senior civilian leadership's mouths. These things were not based on intelligence that we saw, that everyone saw. They were based on a very selective reading of the intelligence and then a creative packaging such that you could push through these two big points that the president and the vice president and the whole neoconservative community used to justify this preemptive war on Iraq.
Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate in the fall of 2001.
Their policy depends on deception and secrecy. Like every imperial policy in history, even dictatorships have taken great efforts always to disguise what they're doing and why they're doing it to their own people.
This was never about weapons. This has always been about getting Saddam Hussein, and even in the most recent spin-up of this whole weapons issue, the Bush administration knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and yet they continued to use the inspection process as a vehicle to achieve the ultimate goal and objective of regime change.
These guys should be brought up on charges. There should be an investigation about whether these guys should be allowed to serve our country anymore. Because to me, it's criminal to say we're going to send our troops to war based on falsified intelligence, based on puffed up, exaggerated details.
So successful was the propaganda campaign that by 2003, polls were showing that the vast majority of Americans believed the unfounded claims that Saddam Hussein was linked to 9/11 and that he possessed stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. beliefs that allowed the administration to frame an invasion of Iraq as a non-aggressive, justified act of self-defense under international law, rather than an offensive action designed to extend U.S. empire.
Contrary to the lies told to the American people, Iraq had absolutely no connections with 9/11. Al-Qaeda was despised by the regime in Iraq, which was a secular regime, not interested in religion as such, but they still wanted to go for it. And so they delayed it. They went into Afghanistan first, and then they decided to go for Iraq. Now, why did they decide to go for Iraq? That's the interesting question.
And I think the whole business with Iraq is a terribly sour comedy, abstracted down to its smallest motives. But finally, there was no real, what there was the sense that Iraq had to be invaded because it was the first step in going toward American empire.
There's no doubt that Saddam Hussein was a tyrant, a thug, a butcher. It's true. It was as true in 2003 as it was in 1983-84 when Donald Rumsfeld visited Iraq and met with Saddam Hussein and other top officials as an emissary of the Reagan administration to improve ties to Iraq. It was true in 1988 when Saddam gassed the Kurdish people in the north of Iraq with the implicit support of the United States. The United States was unconcerned with the fate of the Shia people in the south of Iraq in 1991 when, after the Gulf War had ended, the U.S. allowed Saddam Hussein to very brutally put down the uprising that the United States had encouraged. In other words, the United States has consistently supported Saddam Hussein throughout the worst of his crimes when his policy was consistent with U.S. interests in the area. The minute that those interests changed, then Saddam Hussein became the center of evil in the world.
Saddam Hussein's regime is a grave and gathering danger.
This is the way propaganda is used to motivate a public to support a war that is really not about liberating anyone, but about extending and deepening American control.
We support democracy when it's convenient to the interests of the United States of America. And maybe I'm an idealist if, when I believe that there should be some sort of standard for determining how we conduct our foreign policy, but I believe there should be a standard. We are seen in the world as hypocrites, we're seen as liars, we're seen as an imperialist power.
But what they're trying to do is have an Iraq that is a friend to us, not an Iraq that is liberated. This is total bogus. We never intended to liberate the Iraqi people. We intended to liberate Iraq from Saddam and have a footprint, a military footprint there. And we've done that now. We have Kuwait, we have Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, we have a nice base in Qatar, but it's a little too far south. And what do we have? We have 4 bases in Iraq. Beautiful bases. We can hit Syria, we can hit Iran, we can keep tabs on Afghanistan. There's all kinds of things we can do from those bases.
The larger picture is being driven by the fact that we're about to hit peak oil worldwide, that there's this sort of emerging global competition between us and China. There's the ongoing economic rivalries between us and Europe. And so Southwest Asia becomes geopolitically a linchpin.
And the idea is if you want to have real leverage or control in the future global economy, if you can sit back and control the tap for natural gas mostly and oil secondly, but very importantly, that will give you enormous strategic power in the world.
The war in Iraq was very, very clearly about oil, as was the invasion of Afghanistan also. The oil pipeline that was planned, the best security for that was an occupation of Afghanistan.
If you map the pipeline, proposed pipeline route across Afghanistan, and you look at our bases, matches perfectly. Our bases are there to solve a problem that Taliban could not solve. Taliban couldn't provide security in that part of Afghanistan. Well, now that's where our bases are. So does that have to do with Osama bin Laden? It has nothing to do with Osama bin Laden. It has everything to do with a longer plan, and in this case, a strategy, which I wouldn't necessarily call neoconservative. However, it fits perfectly in with the neoconservative ideology, which says if you have military force and you need something from a weaker country, then you need to deploy that force and take what you need because your country's needs are paramount. It's the whole idea of unilateralism, of about using force to achieve your aims.
All of this
on one hand described as part of an anti-terrorist strategy, but underlying it is this blueprint, the Cheney blueprint, for increasing Americans' access to and control over the rest of the world's oil.
The context is the desire of the United States to control these strategically crucial regions. The pretext, that is the excuse for going in Afghanistan was about terrorism and Osama bin Laden. In Iraq, it's about weapons of mass destruction and Saddam Hussein. But in the end, neither one of those wars was really about those people or those regimes. It was about securing and solidifying American control over these incredibly important regions of the world.
We just pulled out here yesterday just to come out and help protect the oil line.
In a tank?
In a tank.
So yeah, they're interested in oil, but that's a middle-run interest. Their immediate goal is intimidation. So when people say, for example, which is very frequent, that it's all about oil, of course oil is important, and of course we want control of oil, but oil isn't enough to explain a war on Iraq.
The major reason to take Iraq was a display of imperial power. It was to show both the Arab world, but not just them, but to show Europe and the Far Eastern Bloc, China and the Koreans, who was master.
To make it so apparent and so overwhelming at the very outset of potential military operations that the adversary quickly realizes that there is no real alternative here other than to fight and die or to give up.
What will follow will not be a repeat of any other conflict. It will be of a force and scope and scale that has been beyond what has been seen before.
It had been planned for months, and now, one day after that first airstrike, the Pentagon's shock and awe campaign was underway. The idea: to blitz the capital with bombs, to stun the Iraqis into a quick surrender.
This is the beginning of the shock and awe campaign. According to one official, this is going to be the entire 9 yards.
It was a breathtaking display of firepower.
And the Pentagon says, we ain't seen nothing yet.
And we keep talking about this overwhelming force that we're prepared to use. I'm wondering, are you concerned at all that we will be seen as a bully?
While it may have appeared to American TV viewers that shock and awe was merely a catchy media label for the U.S. bombing campaign in Iraq, its actual origins and a whole theory of warfare are found in a 1996 advisory report published by the National Defense University. Authored by Harlan Ullman of the National War College, it argues that the aim of modern warfare is not merely to achieve military victory, but also, by means of sheer intimidation, to inflict a deep psychological injury, to scare and terrorize potential rivals into submission. It is, in effect, the practical application of the Wolfowitz doctrine of global domination through force. Describing shock and awe as, quote, massively destructive strikes directly at the public will, Ullman writes, quote, intimidation and compliance are the outputs we seek to obtain. The intent here is to impose a regime of shock and awe through delivery of instant, nearly incomprehensible levels of massive destruction directed at influencing society writ large. Through very selective, utterly brutal and ruthless, and rapid application of force to intimidate, Ullman continues, the aim is to affect the will, perception, and understanding of the adversary. Without senses, the adversary becomes impotent and entirely vulnerable.
The reasons for the extreme hostility and fear that quickly rose all over the world were not just the invasion of Iraq, but the fact that the invasion was understood to be an action taken to demonstrate that this program for global domination by force and crushing of any potential challenge was meant extremely seriously.
And what did we see in the aftermath of September 11, 2001? immediate action on all fronts. The Patriot Act was passed here in the United States without public debate, without any debate by Congress, just passed. It's a frontal assault on the Constitution.
Attorney General Ashcroft moved aggressively after the attacks, expanding the executive branch's legal authority.
Our assault on terror, our war on terror, allows us to justify and legitimate a whole bunch of things that I think are pretty scary and frightening.
They can come into your home or my home, plant listening devices, take documents, photograph documents, tap the phone, and not tell you about it, and get away with it.
Right now, as we talk, the Fourth and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution, to the Bill of Rights, are dead letters.
Despite being a U.S. citizen, Jose Padilla has been held indefinitely in a naval brig in South Carolina. He's never been charged and hasn't seen a lawyer.
This administration has, in effect, repealed key sections of the Bill of Rights. They've actually suspended habeas corpus in their Patriot Act. They have made indefinite detention possible.
All of these things should be of the gravest concern to Americans. And yet it's being done all under this guise of fear. We have to do this because the terrorists are lurking behind every door.
Today, the Justice Department did issue a blanket alert. It was in recognition of a general threat we received. This is not the first time the Justice Department have acted like this. I hope it's the last. But given the attitude of the evildoers, it may not be.
The more we're afraid, the more you ask us to give. Patriot Act 2, enhancements to the Patriot Act. Now the budget's starting to be bankrupted. Billions flowing out of this country into a war on terror. More defense expenditures.
Therefore, I've asked Congress for a one-year increase of more than $48 billion for national defense, the largest increase in a generation.
Perpetual war, the loss of civil liberties, the lack of trust in government because they don't tell the truth. These are outrageous and unpleasant political developments, but they don't necessarily spell the end of the United States. Financial bankruptcy does.
To maintain the Bush administration's war doctrine, massive increases in military spending have been required. The United States now spends more than $400 billion annually on the military, 7 times as much as the next biggest spender, and nearly equal to what the rest of the world spends combined. Such vast expenditures on military machinery and war, together with the largest tax cuts in history, have driven the Bush administration's record budget deficits. They have also been responsible for deepening the national debt, which by the end of 2004 figures to stand at over $7 trillion, more than 3 times the size of the debt of the entire Third World. Foreign countries hold the notes on about 1/3 of this unprecedented U.S. debt.
That money must be paid back. And that means somewhere down the road, Americans will pay taxes and get nothing.
Debt is reaching forward to future generations, taking their wealth, bringing it onto current account and spending it. It's like if I mortgaged my home and used the money for crack or something, just some expenditure. Eventually, you're going to lose your home.
The image and the rhetoric is tough America going it alone. The reality is in hoc, in debt America begging others for money. The cowboy stopping occasionally with the horse, getting off the saddle, going to the Western Union, and wiring money to the rest of the world is not in a lot of Western films because it doesn't seem super cool, but that would be our cowboy. Our cowboy is going to have to hop off that horse periodically, by the way, the horse that he won't own, and make payments to whoever does own the horse and the saddle and the gun and the boots and the hat.
And the basis of U.S. economic strength today is the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency all over the world. And that's a political phenomenon. Now, if tomorrow, and I think it will occur tomorrow or the next day, these countries decide that that makes no economic sense for them. It never made political sense, but it makes no economic sense for them. Then the U.S. goes down the drain. I mean, it really goes down the drain in terms of a real reduction in standard of living and so forth.
Over the next few years, if the neocons get their way, we're going to see increased money for the Pentagon, increased tax breaks for very wealthy people, and fewer dollars that are going to go to education, housing, healthcare, and other basic needs.
Things that can't go on forever don't. What we're talking about right now is the rigged American economy can't go on forever, and it's not rocket science to say so.
In a lot of ways, U.S. power in the world is collapsing. What these neoconservatives are trying to do is to compensate with military might and muscle and force what they're losing in terms of economic control.
I'm a war president. I make decisions here in the Oval Office in foreign policy matters with war on my mind.
They are people who want war forever. And this makes them much more like fascist movements than it does like conservative movements.
One war after another, we become a warfare state. That is, the system is set up to go to war. We're going to find wars. We've already had two major wars, Iraq and Afghanistan.
One of the major characteristics of the process of militarizing an entire society is going to be the glorification of war and of weapons.
A Hollywood set designer was brought in to create a $200,000 backdrop for official war briefings.
In USA Today and in the major network coverage and so forth, you have this very elaborate computer-generated graphic sort of coverage of the different U.S. Air Force and Army planes and gunships and helicopters and very snazzy weapons of all descriptions.
Well, it's quite amazing. I've fallen almost in love with the F-18 Super Hornet because it's quite a versatile plane.
There was really an idolatry there, a kind of gods of metal worship that again is an extreme perversion, I think, in human terms.
7 months after the bombing campaign, the Patent Office reports a flood of applications to use the phrase for products. There are filings to trademark golf clubs, action toys, coffee makers, even shock and awe condoms.
And it's not enough for us to be told to accept this war. We're really encouraged to gain some kind of vicarious pleasure from it.
Full-length DVD presented by Tom Brokaw, Operation Iraqi Freedom. Log on to shopnbc.com and get it today.
One of the most important roles of the news media is to make sure the American public never sees the effects of war. So we see the tanks from which the shells are fired. We see the soldiers firing those shells. We don't see the people killed and maimed by those shells. The American public has received a very one-sided view of war.
I, for one, don't think that we should censor photographs of people who are wounded or dead. I think we should see them in living color every single night. You know, now they hide behind it. Well, that's, you know, that would be insensitive and all that stuff.
Some of it, after careful thought and trying to be responsible as well as sensitive, we have electronically blurred.
Well, of course it'd be insensitive. And people need to be sensitized to what's really going on.
In addition to the thousands of Iraqi civilians who've been killed during the war and occupation, more than 600 American service members have fallen, with thousands more wounded and permanently maimed. Each one of these casualties represents a family shattered by the war.
If you travel to where people are really living and where soldiers are really coming from, just the, you know, poor communities all around this country, people know what's up with the war. And people don't like it, and they don't support it.
Jesus Suarez del Solar was one of the first American victims of the war in Iraq. He left behind a wife, a young son, and a father, Fernando Suarez del Solar, forced to come to terms with their loss.
This war destroyed a lot of families. This family is destroyed. And my grandson lost the father. I lost the opportunity to good relation with the father and the mother. And when Jesus was leaving in February 5, he told me, Father, I come back, no worry about it. But something happened. Take care of my son, wife my son, and make the same education you give me. And I say, no worry about it, you come back. I never come back.
Stan Goff is a retired Army Special Forces Master Sergeant. His son is currently serving in Iraq. In November of 2003, Goff wrote an open letter to American troops in Iraq. He drew connections between his own combat experience in the Vietnam War and what he now sees American troops experiencing in Iraq.
Two of the hardest days I had this year. One was when I said goodbye to my son. And one was the day after the truck bomb went off on the 11th of December in Ramadi, where he is. Because it took 2 days before we heard anything from him, and we were on pins and needles. I have additional fears. I have the fear that he's going to come back as crazy as I was when I came back from Vietnam. And, you know, a lot of us went crazy in different ways, you know. I don't know how many helicopter pilots I talked to that came back from Vietnam that said, I just loved greasing them. It was the biggest thrill of their life. It was just to find somebody where there were no witnesses and hose them down. And way more common than most people realize. People at My Lai got caught. That stuff was going on every single day somewhere.
An atrocity-generating situation. That's what we have in Iraq right now. The attacks on our troops, they are clearly inspiring a kind of trigger happiness and a readiness for revenge in our troops that I think will result in the same kind of things we saw in My Lai.
I wrote the piece, said hold on to your humanity, specifically to describe how that process happens to some people, why it happens, how at the very bottom of it is the ability to redefine people whose nation you occupy are somehow less than human.
In November of 2003, a U.S. delegation of military families and veterans visited Iraq. Medea Benjamin of Global Exchange helped organize the trip and accompanied the group.
The son of one of the members of our delegation said to him, his father, Dad, they hate us here. They saw us first as liberators, and now they see us as occupiers, and they hate us. They want us to go home. We want to go home. One woman who saw her daughter for the first time in 3 years, because her daughter had been stationed in Germany, and this mother broke down and cried seeing her daughter, and she said, if I had the money to put my daughter in college, she would be holding a book instead of a gun. She shouldn't be holding a gun. None of these kids should be holding guns.
Foreign policy was hijacked by some people that I think it's cruel but proper. General Zinni of the Marine Corps called them chicken hawks, war lovers, but who have no experience of either barracks life or of war, who are abstract enthusiasts for empire.
How many of these men, who are the neocon intellectuals, avoided military service when they had the chance, or when they were of draft age? They avoided it, but yet, of course, they're willing to send, blue-collar men, white working class, and men of color from the poor and working classes off to kill and die for their imperial ambitions. But they're sitting in their Tony offices in Washington and New York.
I'm an American first and foremost. I love my country more than anything. I'm willing to die for my country. I'm like George W. Bush, our president. Mr. Chicken Hawk, a guy who couldn't even have the courage to see through his tour of duty in the Air National Guard. Maybe flying F-102s over Houston, Texas was too dangerous, so he ran off to Alabama while millions of Americans were going to Vietnam. And he has an administration chock full of these so-called heroes, people who didn't have the courage to defend their country in a time of unpopular war, and yet today they've got us engaged in another unpopular war, and they're asking other people to go out there and do things.
We call them chicken hawks because none of them served in the military. They didn't wear a uniform. They all had other things to do. None of their children serve in the military. So this is a double chicken hawk whammy here because, George Bush's daughters don't wear a uniform. It's funny, he says, my daughter's the same age as Jessica Lynch. Yeah, but there's a big difference. Jessica Lynch wore a uniform and did what you guys told him to do.
You say you're the leader of the free world because you have military experience, and we find out you've been AWOL. You didn't really show up. There are holes even in the stories you put forth in the media now to suggest I was there. Look, I have memories of it. I remember that I was there.
There isn't anyone who can stand up and say, I served with George W. Bush.
These records ought to have been noted by his commanding officers.
Some of his officers don't recall ever seeing him.
That's a simple question. How about a simple answer?
Bush was a draft dodger. Not only that, he was AWOL. In fact, he was a deserter, because if it's longer than 30 days, you're a deserter. The guy was actually a deserter in wartime. If it had been Clinton, they would have just crucified him on the White House lawn.
I was in Iraq when George Bush made the comment when he was talking about Iraqi attacks on U.S. soldiers, and he said, bring them on.
There are some who feel like that, the conditions are such that they can attack us there. My answer is bring them on.
And you should have seen the reaction among the troops when they heard that. They started saying, bring on the attacks. We're the ones who are out here on the streets doing patrol that are the targets. How could he be saying that? This can only be coming from people who never fought. He can dress himself up all he wants in this military gear and show up on aircrafts and present himself with a turkey in front of the troops. This guy never fought a war.
He's not qualified to speak of himself as macho, but he's shrewd enough to know that those working males out there are very angry, and that if he presents himself as macho, as he did, of course, with that ridiculous flight in the back seat of that fast plane to land on the carrier in full combat gear, if he presents himself that way, they'll buy it. They'll buy it because they need it.
Recent AP poll showed Mr. Bush leading his Democratic opponent, John Kerry, by almost 20% when it comes to white men.
On his visit to Ground Zero a few days after the catastrophe, he took the bullhorn and stood alongside some of the rescue workers and basically did the one thing he has always been undeniably good at, which is cheerleading. He was a cheerleader at Phillips Andover, actually, and very good at it. But this is the culture of TV, where the press really only cares about and only responds to televisual performance. And at a moment where everybody wanted a big daddy, Bush did well enough to allow the press to marvel at his aplomb, at his stature, and it became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
If I had a little window into the average American household, like 5 minutes on their TV screen at night, to tell them how to decode the kind of propaganda they're going to see from President Bush about security, I think, I would say, first of all, don't just look at the images. Don't just look at Bush landing on the aircraft carrier, Bush surrounding himself with our troops.
Hooah! Semper Fi.
They want him to look tough. They want him to look strong. In fact, even on Earth Day, the image they chose was him with an axe in his hand, clearing trails in the Adirondacks. So, his administration is so dripping with testosterone that even to celebrate Earth Day, the guy's got to have a weapon in his hand.
They lose no opportunity to take pictures of Bush on the ranch, outdoors, not sitting at a desk, wearing, reading glasses and having, intellectual conversations, but out walking, clearing brush, sitting on the back of a pickup truck. Those images are plentiful, and that's not an accident. That's how they've understood Bush's popularity, is he is the rugged individualist. He is the cowboy.
The Republicans have ingeniously, created this sense that this is about real men. It's time for real men to step to the plate. Now, enough of this namby-pamby, because George W. represents the reborn American male.
Bush's propagandists have been masterful at crafting a certain image for him, actually based to some extent on his weaknesses. He's not a guy who was born in Connecticut and was a legacy admission to Phillips Andover and Yale. He's not a guy who has the Queen of England as a cousin. He's not a guy from a fabulously wealthy family. None of that is the case. He's just Will Rogers. He's just a regular guy, and when he messes up the language, it proves he's just like you and me.
I understand the emotionality of the death penalty. U.S. Daily's story about subliminal messages, reduced power plant emissions. First time we may be completely certain he has nuclear weapons. Some accuse us both of not being able to speak the language.
That's quite brilliant, you know, is to make Bush out to be a kind of Jacksonian figure, kind of natural leader from the wilds, you know.
President Bush and his colleagues talk about a certain America to defend their policies. They think America still is back in the 19th century, where the tough guys can take out one another in an open combat, man against man, high noon on Main Street with Gary Cooper, being played by President Bush.
I want him held. I want justice. And there's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said "Wanted, dead or alive."
He's not Gary Cooper. He's a coward who bushwhacked the American people by exploiting the fear and ignorance engendered in the post-9/11 environment to portray Iraq as a threat to our national security, weapons of mass destruction that would destroy the very society that we live in. The need, therefore, for frontier justice to prevent mushroom clouds from popping up all over American cities. He lied to us. He bushwhacked us.
You know, you think of past elections, Michael Dukakis, you think of the, you know, him riding around in the tank looking like Snoopy, you know. You think of the Willie Horton ad against him. You know, you don't really think of substantive things because our elections rarely turn anymore on substantive issues. But this is one that really needs to be decided on the substance because our country faces real threats. But these guys are not going after the right threats. They are pursuing a pre-existing agenda under the guise of fighting terrorism that is going to bankrupt our country, that is going to put our troops at risk, and that is going to make the terrorist threat to us grow over time instead of diminish.
In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, the people of the United States came together in an unprecedented display of national unity, and the world rallied to their cause. Across the globe, people came together in a spontaneous and stunning display of unified support for the people of the United States. Yet just 2 years later, in those same places and on those same streets, tens of millions of people would come together again, this time to march in outrage over the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq. How the American people interpret the meaning and importance of this dramatic and sudden shift is a question that has yet to be answered.
One of the things that the exercise of power does is that it cuts both ways. So the US exercises power in the world to create stability. People who are on the receiving end of that power, right, see themselves being oppressed. And so they resist. And as a consequence, this process of trying to pacify the world and get it to go along with what the United States wants actually creates the resistance that the US is trying to quell. And so this is not the way that will actually get us forward out of the situation that we find ourselves in. It only makes things worse.
I would say that the war against Iraq not only is not part of the war against terror, meaning against Al-Qaeda or against terrorist networks, but it virtually gives up the war on terror. It substitutes for it and suppresses it, in the sense that I think it's impossible to think of reducing the threat from Osama bin Laden and from Al-Qaeda so long as we are occupying Iraq and killing Muslims in Iraq.
Well, I look at this from the point of view of a mother. I have 2 children. I want my children to live in a safe world. I don't want any more September 11th to happen. And I look at what this government has done post-September 11th, and I think not much more you could have done to make us less safe.
Why do people in the U.S. think that if we have bigger weapons and more weapons, it's going to make us safe from terrorists? We have the most advanced military in the world. We have the most sophisticated weapons in the world. We have more nuclear weapons than anybody in the world. Did that stop September 11th? It didn't stop it.
I think it's really important that we begin to redefine national security. If people don't have jobs, if people can't provide education for their children, if people are going hungry, if people don't have health insurance, they're insecure. We need to be able to address that level of insecurity in this country. And the federal government is not addressing those needs because we're pouring all this money into a unilateral war and providing tax breaks for very wealthy people.
We have a set of religious beliefs here that to the extent that we must support the wealthy, the rich, that the rich are in terrible trouble, that if we don't take care of the rich, everything terrible will happen. Well, my feeling is the rich can always take care of themselves. That's why they're rich. They have a wonderful skill for making money. They don't need our government help. They need to be impeded by the government. It'll bring out the best in them. At the same time, it'll level the playing field a little bit.
So I think what it really comes down to is, are the American voters going to sit still for this? Are we going to treat our democracy like some sort of spectator sport, like watching the Super Bowl? Or are we going to ask a little more of ourselves this time? Are we going to explore these claims? Are we going to look at the details of what this administration has actually done?
Good societies have cultivated fearlessness and hope among their citizens. Good politics has always been about real courage, real fearlessness. Take Gandhi, whose ultimate weapon was fearlessness against one of the worst empires of our times. And the very notion of not cooperating with that empire was based on fearlessness. When Martin Luther King walked in the Gandhian tradition, he walked in fearlessness. Every leader worth their names promotes fearlessness.
I found it odd in the build-up to the war that the media would portray your ideal patriot either as the service member away from home or somebody on the street corner waving a flag and shouting, "We support the troops." I can train a monkey to wave a flag. That does not make the monkey patriotic. I can't train a monkey to read the Constitution or live the Constitution. On the other opposite end of that street was another group of Americans who also had the American flag, who said support the troops, but bring them home. Those are patriots too. I think we have to understand that the definition of patriotism cannot be hijacked by people with a specific ideological agenda.
Patriotism is when we say we have love for our nation, we have love for our communities, and sometimes our nation does things that are positive, and sometimes our nation does things that are negative, and it's my responsibility out of my love for this nation to speak out loudly in support of the things that it does well, and speak out loudly against those things that it's doing that is hurtful.
I think the people most without fear on September 12th in America were those working at Ground Zero. They were in the greatest danger, actually, but because they were active, they were engaged. The firemen and the medical officials and the cops who were working there first to find victims, then to find remains and clear the site. They had a civic task. They were engaged and they weren't afraid of anything. American citizens after 9/11 said to the president, "What can we do? What can we do to become engaged and take some responsibility?" President Bush unfortunately said, "Go shopping. Go back to the mall. Go back to your normal lives. We'll take care of it." Spectatorship is an invitation to fear. Citizenship is how we fight the politics of fear. The politics of citizenship, the politics of engagement, taking responsibility is a much better way to deal with terrorism than hunkering down, being spectators, and allowing the government to rob us of our liberties, to rob us of our multiculturalism in the name of protecting us.
And that's their project, is to make us scared and stupid. And see, my problem is I've been to Washington, D.C. and stood in the middle of the night out in the Jefferson Memorial and read the inscriptions of Jefferson's quotes that are hammered into the marble. And you look up inside the rotunda, the favored quote at the highest point of the building. You have to turn around backwards to read it. He says, "On the altar of God, I pledge undying hostility to any government restriction on the free minds of the people." We were the first nation state to establish the principle that sovereignty, ultimate political power, resides in the people. That's a fundamentally radical concept, and these guys don't like the implications of it for their maintenance of minority wealth and power, and they're out to destroy that. But they will fail. I guarantee you they will fail.